The first thing you notice isn't the house, it's the air. A winter night in the Chicago suburbs has a way of stripping everything down to essentials. Pale streetlights, hard shadows, the hush of neighborhoods that go still early. But this quiet isn't peaceful. It's the kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something to happen. Like the world is holding its breath because it already knows what's under the floor. A ranch house sits behind a thin line of snow-darkened grass. Nothing about it announces a headline. No Gothic architecture, no broken windows, no cinematic warning. It looks like every other home built for ordinary families who wanted ordinary lives. And then someone opens the door. The smell doesn't rush out like a jump scare. It seeps. It clings to fabric. It settles into the back of your throat. It's not a single odor either. It's layered. Damp earth, old wood, a faint chemical sting from cleaning products used too often, too desperately. And under it all, a note so wrong your body recognizes it before your mind names it. The kind of smell that makes people step back without knowing why. Flashlights cut through the hallway, and the beams feel thinned, like they don't belong here. The officers move carefully, not because they expect an ambush, but because the space feels arranged, like someone who lived here spent years practicing what to show and what to hide. Every object in its place, every surface calm, every room pretending to be a normal room. Then one of them reaches the basement access. The door opens. Cold air rises up in a slow exhale. The beam hits the stairs. And down there, below the level of ordinary life, there is a darkness that feels less like absence of light and more like a container, like a sealed compartment, like a place that has been holding something for a long time. This isn't a ghost story. There is no apparition waiting at the bottom step, no demonic chant. But the dread is immediate, because the dread comes from a simple, devastating fact. Some secrets aren't supernatural. They're human. And once a secret becomes physical, once it has weight and smell and space, no one in that house can unknow it. This is the John Wayne Gacy case. And if you already know the nickname, the Killer Clown, forget it for a moment. Because the clown isn't the scariest part. The scariest part is the house, the crawl space, the normal street, and the way evil can learn to wear a neighbor's face so convincingly that entire communities smile at it. The story people tell begins at the end, December 1978. A missing 15-year-old named Robert Peast and a contractor whose name appears in the margins of that disappearance until the margins become the center. That disappearance is the spark that finally lights the fuse. It's the moment the case stops being a series of lonely vanishings and becomes something police can't ignore. It's what drags the darkness out from under the floorboards and into the open air. But the truth is, this story started long before 1978. It started in a boy's childhood, where fear was already present, already rehearsed, already built into his bones like a blueprint. John Wayne Gacy was born March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. He was named after the movie star John Wayne, a detail that sounds almost ironic in hindsight, because names can be costumes too, and this story is full of costumes. According to reputable summaries, his father was an alcoholic and reportedly abusive, a presence in the home that taught a specific lesson. Love can be conditional, masculinity can be weaponized, and humiliation can feel like discipline when it comes from the one person you're supposed to trust. If you want a single psychological seed for what comes later, it's this. Children don't choose the rooms they grow up in, but those rooms teach them what a human life is worth. Gacy's early years were marked by instability and the kind of emotional weather that leaves long-term damage. In various biographies, he's described as struggling to fit his father's idea of real masculinity, an impossible standard enforced with cruelty and contempt. And when a child grows up under that kind of pressure, two things can happen. They break, or they learn to mimic. Mimicry is survival.
Mimicry becomes craft. And in some people, mimicry becomes a way to move through the world without ever being seen. By the time he reached young adulthood, the surface version of John Gacy looked like a classic American climb, a man who wanted to be admired, who wanted to be recognized, who wanted to become the kind of figure people take seriously. He enrolled at Northwestern Business College and graduated in 1963, according to Britannica. He married, moved, worked, and began shaping a respectable identity, one that could be photographed, praised, and trusted. Because trust is the most powerful camouflage. In 1964, he married Marlon Myers and moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where he managed Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises owned by his father-in-law. He became active in his community, involved with the Gacy's, the kind of civic organization that makes a man look wholesome on paper. This is one of the most unsettling patterns in American true crime, the way community involvement can be used as insulation, not proof of goodness, just proof of access. The more people see you as helpful, the less they notice the coldness behind your eyes. But the surface story cracks early. In 1968, Gacy was convicted of sodomy in Iowa and sentenced to 10 years in prison, a fact widely documented in timelines and summaries of his life. He was paroled after serving roughly 18 months. That period matters not only because it reveals violent sexual behavior, but because it reveals something else: the system's limited ability to predict what certain people will do next. When he was released, he returned to Illinois. He rebuilt the surface story again, like someone repainting a wall that keeps bleeding through. And here, the geography begins to matter. Because the crimes that later horrified the country are not set in some faraway exotic wilderness. They happen in neighborhoods, on regular streets, in the kind of places where people are confident enough to let their guard down. In 1971, with help from his mother, he bought a ranch-style home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in an unincorporated area of Norwood Park Township, part of metropolitan Chicago. A ranch house, low profile, one story, a crawl space underneath. And if you've ever crawled under a house, you know what that space feels like. It isn't a basement with a ceiling you can stand under. It's a low, compressed world where air turns stale quickly, where dust coats your tongue, where the dark is not dramatic, it's close, it presses against your face. It makes you breathe shallow without realizing it. It's the kind of space that turns human beings into shapes. And for a while, the crawl space is nothing more than architecture, a fact of construction, a detail no one thinks about. That's the real horror of how this unfolds. Nothing about the house looks like a murder weapon. It just looks convenient. During these same years, Gacy constructed another layer of camouflage. He built a business. He built relationships. He built a reputation as someone energetic, social, helpful. According to widely cited accounts, he hosted parties and moved in circles where people assumed he was safe. Safety is not a feeling, though. It's a decision people make based on what they think they know. And people thought they knew him. Then, young men began to disappear. Not in a way that made front pages immediately, not the way people notice when a child from a wealthy suburb vanishes. These were teenagers and young men, often runaways, often marginalized, often the kind of missing person the 1970s American system didn't always chase with urgency. Their families noticed, their friends noticed, but society has a cruel habit of assigning different levels of value to different lives. And this is where the story becomes suffocating. Because the horror isn't only that the killings happened, the horror is how long the world could go on pretending nothing was happening because the victims weren't important enough to stop everything. Gacy's later conviction would cover 33 murders committed between 1972 and 1978. He was ultimately convicted in 1980, and the number 33 becomes the case's cold arithmetic. But numbers hide something essential. These were individuals with names, families, habits, small dreams, and ordinary futures, stolen quietly, one at a time, under the fluorescent hum of suburban normal.
When the murders begin, the case file does not open with blood. It opens with a pattern of absence. A boy doesn't come home. A friend says he was going to meet someone. A parent calls around and hears nothing. A phone rings and rings and rings, and the world keeps moving. In the mythology, the word clown dominates this case, but the clown persona is a side corridor. It's a cultural symbol that later becomes a shortcut for horror, because the idea of a clown represents forced cheer, artificial friendliness, a painted smile that doesn't have to match the eyes. But most of the time, the monster in this case didn't need grease paint. He used something far more effective. He used opportunity. He used authority. He used the promise of work. He used the fact that young men can be flattered into vulnerability by an older man saying, "You look strong. You want a job? You want to make real money?" And he used something else too, the thing that turns this case into a kind of psychological nightmare that lingers long after you learn the facts.
He used the handcuffs. A trick that appears in multiple accounts of his modus operandi, the idea that he could frame restraint as a joke, a demonstration, a harmless act, a moment of playful control that turns into real control before the victim fully understands what's happening. That detail, restraint framed as comedy, is the bridge between the respectable contractor and the killer clown. It's the same mechanism, not paint, not balloons. Control disguised as play. You can feel the shape of it. You can feel why it worked. Because in a normal world, if someone offers you a pair of handcuffs as a joke, your brain labels it as weird, but not lethal. Your brain doesn't want to believe a lethal outcome can exist in such an ordinary setting. That reluctance is what predators depend on. And if you want the most frightening truth of all, it's this: human beings are trained to be polite, even when they're uncomfortable, even when danger is present, even when the right decision would be to run. So the story moves forward, year by year, disappearance by disappearance, while the house remains a house, the street remains a street, and the crawl space remains a piece of architecture waiting to become something else. Then, December 11th, 1978 arrives, the day Robert Piest vanishes. According to widely cited accounts, Piest was a 15-year-old working at Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. That day, a contractor, John Wayne Gacy, visited the store about a remodeling job, and Piest left after mentioning a contractor wanted to talk to him about work. He never came back. This is where dread takes on a specific form, because a missing child is different. It triggers a different kind of urgency. It forces people to look harder. And when police start looking hard, they begin noticing that the nice guy with the business and the parties and the civic connections has edges that don't fit his image. Witnesses begin recalling little things, odd interactions, moments that felt off but weren't enough to accuse. And then the case begins to tighten. You can feel it like a noose drawing slowly, not dramatic at first, procedural, paperwork, questions, timelines, a name repeated, a man followed, a car watched, and the entire time the house sits there, quiet, pretending. This is the point where I'll ask you to subscribe if you want more documentaries like this. Slow burn, deeply researched, and psychologically unsettling. Because from here, the story doesn't explode all at once. It compresses. It gets narrower. It gets closer to the floor, closer to the crawl space, closer to the thing beneath the house that people smelled for years and chose to accept as moisture, sewer, old pipes, anything but the truth. In the next stretch of this documentary, we'll do 3 things carefully. We'll go back and trace the escalation of the crimes without sensationalizing them, how the disappearances clustered, how the pattern hid inside normal life. We'll walk the investigation step by step,
beginning with Robert Piest, the surveillance, the warrants, and the moments that made detectives realize they weren't dealing with one missing boy. They were dealing with a structure, a system, a man who treated the suburbs like a hunting ground. And then, once that structure breaks, we'll go into the part that never leaves people, the discovery process, the literal unearthing, the days when the neighborhood became a scene and the world learned what a crawl space can hold. Because once you understand what was under that house, you'll never hear the word home the same way again.
The escalation doesn't begin with a scream. It begins with a door opening politely. A young man steps inside for what he thinks is a normal reason, an offer of work, a drink, a ride, a conversation that feels like a shortcut into adulthood. He's not entering a lair in his mind, he's entering a home, a ranch house, a place where the living room has ordinary furniture, the kitchen smells like coffee, and the man greeting him has a firm handshake and a voice trained to sound helpful. That's the first layer of the trap. The setting is familiar. The second layer is harder to name, but easier to feel. The man inside the house doesn't behave like a stranger. He behaves like someone you're supposed to trust, like a boss, a neighbor, a local figure, someone with community gravity. And the human brain is wired to follow gravity even when it leads somewhere cold. John Gacy rebuilt his life in Illinois like a stage set. He remarried. Britannica notes that in 1972 he married Carol Hoff, a former classmate. 2 years later, he founded a contracting business, PDM, which became successful, and many of his employees were teenage boys. The details read like a normal American blueprint: work, marriage, money, community. But when you lay those facts next to what we now know, the blueprint becomes something else. It becomes infrastructure. A business is not just income, it's access. It's a reason to speak to young people without raising alarms. It's a reason to bring them to your property. It's a reason to say, I can pay you, I can help you, I can give you a chance. And while he built that access, he built another mask, one that would later infect America's imagination permanently. Britannica notes he sometimes appeared as a clown, Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown, at various events. This is one of those details that makes people lean back and say, no, that's too much, that sounds fictional. But it's documented enough to be part of the legitimate public record of who he was. And the reason it haunts people isn't the makeup itself, it's what the makeup represents. A clown is a forced smile, a performance of safety, a figure that exists to lower your defenses, especially a child's defenses. It's cheerfulness as a uniform, it's friendliness you're not allowed to question. And that's the deeper truth of this case. John Gacy didn't just wear a clown suit sometimes, he wore respectability constantly. The clown was only the most literal version of what he was already doing every day. Now we rewind to the first known murder because it didn't start as a pattern, it started as a moment. Britannica identifies his first known victim as 16-year-old Timothy McCoy in 1972, met at Chicago's Greyhound bus station during a layover. McCoy agreed to go to Gacy's house, and there he was killed. It's the kind of fact that sounds like a footnote until you imagine the emotional geography. A teenager in transit, trusting an adult in a city, stepping into a stranger's car because the world still feels basically safe. And then the safety collapses. That first murder matters not just as a beginning, but as a discovery. Because in many predators, the first successful act doesn't produce guilt the way it should. It produces confidence. After that, the story becomes what it always becomes in cases like this. Not a single criminal act, but a routine. The killing becomes integrated into life, the way a bad habit becomes integrated. Something you hide, something you excuse, something you schedule around your public identity. And the public identity was thriving. Gacy's contracting company gave him a stable reason to interact with young men. His home became a workplace in the casual sense, employees stopping by, people dropping in, kids looking for side work. And his social world made him look good. In the community, he was the kind of person people would describe with words like energetic, friendly, helpful,
a man who threw parties, a man who entertained, a man who knew people, a man who, on paper, belonged. Which is why the disappearances stayed what disappearances often are at first: private grief. A teenager doesn't come home, and the family tells themselves it's a misunderstanding. Then they tell themselves it's a runaway situation. Then they tell themselves the police will take it seriously. And when the police don't take it seriously enough, because the victim is a teenage boy, because the 1970s were cruelly casual about certain kinds of missing people, the family begins the slow, desperate ritual of calling hospitals, calling friends, calling anyone who might have seen him last. The tragedy of this case is that those calls happened again and again across years. Each call was a small alarm bell ringing inside a larger society that didn't always listen. And while those bells rang, the house on Summerdale sat there quietly, holding its secret under the floor. Here is where the narrative becomes suffocating, because we have to talk about method without turning it into spectacle. According to Britannica's summary, Gacy's crimes followed a pattern. He would lure victims to his house, sometimes offering a job, give them alcohol or drugs, then introduce a magic trick involving handcuffs. Then he would assault and kill them, often by strangulation or asphyxiation. Even the language magic trick is chilling, because it turns restraint into theater. It turns danger into a game. It transforms resistance into embarrassment, because once you've agreed to the trick, it becomes harder to admit you're scared until it's too late. That's the thing predators understand that most decent people don't. Shame is a lock. If you can make someone feel foolish for being suspicious, you can keep them from reacting. So picture the scene, not with gore, but with psychology. A teenager in a living room that looks normal. A beer offered like a casual adult gesture. A joke about handcuffs. A demonstration. A click. A laugh that dies in the throat because the restraint is real. The room shifts instantly from ordinary to controlled. And when control arrives suddenly, the nervous system doesn't always choose the best action. Sometimes it freezes. Sometimes it bargains. Sometimes it tries to keep the situation social even as it turns violent. That is how suburban horror works, not through monsters, through the failure of normal instincts in abnormal hands. And as the murders continued, the house absorbed them. We know from later recovery efforts that many victims were buried in the crawl space beneath the home, and that when space ran out, additional victims were disposed of elsewhere. Britannica notes 4 bodies were located along the nearby Des Plaines River. That fact is important because it shows escalation, a predator adapting to logistics, a killer making adjustments like a businessman adjusting inventory. That is a sentence that should not make sense, and yet it does. Because the mind that did this was not operating on emotion, it was operating on management, and management leaves traces. People later recalled smells, foul odors that came and went, especially when the furnace kicked on, forcing air through the house and carrying something up from the crawl space that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. It's one of the details that makes this story feel unbearable. The idea that the truth announced itself repeatedly through something as basic as air, and the human brain, wanting normality, worked overtime to label it as plumbing, dampness, old insulation, anything but what it was. This is where you realize the horror is not only the acts, it's the proximity. The idea that neighbors lived near it, that children rode bikes past it, that people stood in that living room, ate food, laughed, and never saw the floor as a lid. Now we move closer to the collapse of the mask, because every long-running double life ends the same way. Not with a confession, with friction. A victim connected to a job, a witness who remembers a name, a parent who pushes, a detective who refuses to let the trail go cold. On December 11th, 1978,
15-year-old Robert Peist disappeared after leaving Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois, saying a contractor wanted to talk to him about a job. Britannica's account of how Gacy was caught notes police learned Gacy was the last person known to have seen Peist and that Peist had gone to Gacy's house to discuss construction work. The disappearance is the lever that finally moves the whole machine. And once detectives had Gacy's name, the case began to change temperature. Not suddenly, procedurally. They obtained a search warrant. They searched the house and found suspicious items. Britannica lists syringes, drugs, and identification belonging to other people. That kind of discovery doesn't prove murder immediately, but it opens a door. It turns a missing boy investigation into a broader scrutiny of the man connected to him. It gives police a reason to keep looking. So, they put him under surveillance. Surveillance is one of the quietest forms of dread. It's not a chase, it's not sirens. It's a slow, watchful pressure applied over time. Detectives followed him. They learned his routines. They noted where he went, who he spoke to, what hours he kept. And as they watched, they did what good investigators do. They widened the net of questioning. Britannica notes they spoke to young men who had previously accused Gacy of assault. That's another suffocating detail. The idea that earlier accusations existed, earlier warnings existed, but they didn't culminate in the kind of intervention that would have stopped everything. Those earlier threads sat loose until the Peist case pulled them tight. And then, in that widening investigation, something surfaced that would later read like a nightmare sentence in a report. Men mentioned digging trenches and spreading lime in the crawl space under Gacy's house. A crawl space, a place designed to be unseen, a place where the ground is close and the air is bad and the darkness is compressed, a place you don't go unless you have to, a place that in normal life holds pipes and wires and spiders, a place that in this story held an entire missing person crisis beneath a family neighborhood. At this point, the case stops being an abstract fear and becomes a physical one. Because investigators don't just suspect something terrible, they suspect it might be literally under their feet. And when a case becomes three-dimensional, when the answer isn't in paperwork but in soil, there is a special kind of dread that settles over everyone involved. Detectives begin to move differently. They speak less. They sleep worse. They prepare for what they might find, and they know, deep down, that no preparation will be enough. The public doesn't fully understand that kind of anticipation, the dread of unearthing, until it happens. Until the neighborhood is no longer a neighborhood, but a scene. Until the yard is no longer a yard, but evidence. Until the house is no longer a house, but a container. In the next stretch, we'll move through the pressure cooker days, the surveillance tightening, the interviews multiplying, the moment the investigation crosses the point of no return. We'll go inside the process by which police stopped looking for one missing boy and began confronting the possibility of a mass of missing boys. And we'll do it the way this story deserves, with psychological horror, not spectacle. Because the scariest parts of the Gacy case aren't what the movies show. The scariest parts are the moments when ordinary life almost stayed ordinary. The moments when a boy could have turned left instead of right. The moments when someone could have trusted their gut and walked away. The moments when a community could have looked closer earlier. Because if you can accept that evil can look like a friendly contractor on a quiet street, then you have to accept something else too. That you might have walked past it yourself and never known.
In most true crime stories, the arrest happens like a punchline. Sirens, cuffs, a quick headline that tells you the danger is over. This one doesn't. This one tightens like a belt. Because when police began shadowing John Gacy after Robert Peist vanished, they weren't following a fugitive. They were following a man who still had the confidence to smile at neighbors. A man who still drove his truck like he owned the road. A man who still walked into stores and spoke to people like he belonged there. And that's what made the surveillance feel so unnatural. The gap between what he looked like and what he was becoming in their minds. The detectives didn't have a monster to chase. They had a contractor with a civic resume and a laugh that could fill a room. So they watched him, the way you watch a locked door you suspect is hiding something loud. They watched him go home. They watched him leave. They watched him at odd hours. They watched him when he didn't know he was being watched. And those are the moments that change an investigation from possible suspect to we need to move. Because people who are hiding something often move differently. Not dramatically, subtly. A few extra glances in mirrors, a longer pause at an intersection, a hesitation before pulling into a driveway, a pattern of driving that feels like a man checking whether his shadow is still behind him. And the night air around Chicago in December has a way of sharpening every little signal. It's cold enough to make exhaust hang in the air like breath. Streetlights glow through thin winter mist. Tires sound louder on frozen pavement. And every time the surveillance team stopped at a distance, they had to sit in that cold and remind themselves that this wasn't paranoia, it was procedure. They had a missing boy, they had a suspect, and they had a house. The first search warrant didn't deliver the kind of instant cinematic proof people expect. It delivered something worse, fragments that suggested a larger hidden structure. The kind of things you don't want to find in a man's home unless you're prepared to follow the implications all the way down. Investigators turned over closets and drawers and looked for evidence connected to Robert Piest. They found items that didn't sit right. They found things that suggested other young men had passed through that life and never fully left it. It wasn't yet a mass murder case in the paperwork. It was a missing person case with a growing sense that the missing wasn't isolated. That's what keeps investigators awake at night, the moment you realize one case might be the doorway into many. And as the days passed, the pressure on Gacy didn't make him vanish, it made him respond. Because predators who have lived comfortably behind masks don't always run the moment they feel heat. Sometimes they do the opposite. They perform normal, harder. They double down. They act offended. They act helpful. They act like the kind of person who could never be accused of something like this. And the system, made of human beings, and human beings are vulnerable to performance, has to work harder to push through that. Police kept interviewing people. They kept pulling on old threads. They returned to prior allegations, prior complaints, prior rumors that had never become headlines. They built a picture of a man who had been accused before, a man with a record, a man who had returned, rebuilt, and placed himself in a position where young men entered his orbit again and again. And then something else began to happen, something that makes this case feel like a slow-motion nightmare. The house started to feel less like a residence and more like a container with a lid. Because the more investigators learned about the crawl space, the low, unseen space beneath the floor, the more the investigation began leaning toward the ground. And leaning toward the ground is terrifying, because the ground doesn't lie. Paper can be forged. Witnesses can be mistaken. A suspect can charm, but soil keeps what it is given. At some point, the investigation crossed the line from "we need to find Robert Piest" to "we need to search that property again, deeper." And that's where the case enters its most oppressive phase. The days when detectives know in their bodies that there is something under that house, something they are not ready to meet, yet the law still requires them to be careful, to gather, to justify, to do it cleanly enough that the truth can survive court. So they kept watching him. And as they watched, the surveillance became its own kind of horror. You can imagine the scene, an unmarked car parked down the street, heaters barely working, coffee cooling in paper cups, the city's winter pressing against the glass. The detectives' eyes burn from staring. Their minds loop the same question. If he did this, what else did he do? Then a strange detail emerges in many retellings, one that sticks because it's so visceral even without graphic imagery: the smell. Not the crawlspace smell, yet, the car smell. The story goes that when Gacy was brought in for questioning, an officer later remarked about an odor that clung to him, the kind of odor that suggests contact with death. Whether every version of that detail is perfectly consistent or not, the idea fits the atmosphere of this case. Death didn't remain politely hidden. It leaked into the edges. It bled into spaces where it didn't belong, cars, hallways, ordinary rooms, like the truth trying to surface. And now we arrive at the interrogation, the moment where the mask meets a mirror. Interrogation rooms are brutal in a quiet way. Fluorescent lighting with no softness, a table that reflects too much, walls designed to be forgettable, a clock that seems to tick louder than it should, the air slightly stale from recycled ventilation. It's a place that forces people to confront the fact that they are human bodies in a controlled box. A controlled box is familiar territory for a man who made control his hobby. Gacy didn't confess immediately. Men like this rarely do. They test, they probe, they perform, they deny with indignation. They offer partial truths, they try to confuse, they try to dominate the room with personality. But the detectives had something he couldn't charm away. Robert Piest's disappearance had witnesses and timing and a direct connection to him. And beyond that, they had the growing weight of a larger pattern, years of missing young men. So the questioning continued, and the pressure continued.
And eventually, the case reached the moment where the story stops being about whether police can prove their suspicion and becomes about how quickly a suspect's private structure collapses once the right tool is applied. Because the right tool isn't always a confession. Sometimes it's a warrant. And when the second, deeper search began, it didn't feel like a search for a missing boy anymore. It felt like opening a sealed compartment. This is the part where horror becomes physical, not through gore, but through space. Imagine investigators at the house again. Winter air, work lights, flashlight beams, tools. The crawl space access, low, tight. Someone has to get on hands and knees and enter a place where the ceiling is too close. The darkness is heavy. The soil is cold. The air is stale, thick with years of trapped odor. And the farther you crawl, the more your flashlight beam becomes a tunnel because the light can't spread the way it does in a normal room. Under house, everything feels like a secret, even innocent things. So when the beam hits disturbed soil, when it hits something that doesn't belong, the body reacts instantly before the mind names what it is. This is where the case becomes what the world remembers, the discovery of bodies buried under the home. No graphic detail is necessary. The fact alone is enough to create nausea, because it means the house wasn't just the scene of a crime. It was storage. It was concealment. It was a long-term plan. It was a place where death lived under the dining room while people ate dinner above it. Once investigators began uncovering remains, the investigation entered a different universe. It stopped being a missing person case. It became a mass murder case unfolding in real time. The number kept growing. Each discovery added weight, added silence, added a grim inevitability. The crawl space turned from an architectural detail into a word people couldn't say without feeling their stomach drop. And that's the moment the mask finally fails. Not in public, not dramatically, but in the private realization that the ground has spoken. After this, the legal and procedural machine moves quickly. Gacy was arrested in late December 1978 and charged. From there, the case rushed toward trial, the public pressed in, and a nation tried to understand how a man could live two lives so close together that they shared the same address. But if you think the horror ends when the police arrive, you haven't felt the second wave yet. The second wave is cultural. Because once the story is public, the neighborhood becomes contaminated. Not literally, but psychologically. Streets become symbols. Homes become suspicious. Crawl spaces become scary. Contractors become unsettling in a way they never were before. And the word clown, a word that once belonged to birthday parties and silly smiles, becomes something else in the American imagination. That transformation is one of the most lasting injuries this case caused. It didn't just kill people, it changed the atmosphere of trust. In the next chunk, we'll go through the arrest and confession phase carefully, what was admitted, how the number of victims became known, and how the investigation expanded beyond the house itself. Then we'll move into the trial and sentencing, and finally, the cultural shockwave, why the killer clown idea stuck, how it shaped horror media, and why even now, decades later,
people feel uneasy when a painted smile appears in the wrong place. Because this case didn't end in 1978, it just stopped being hidden.
Once the crawl space became evidence, the case stopped behaving like a story and started behaving like a catastrophe. That's the only word that fits, catastrophe. Because it isn't just one family losing one child, it's dozens of families suddenly realizing that their missing sons might not be missing in the way people hope. It's detectives realizing they've been working inside a nightmare that had an address, a phone number, a business license, and a friendly reputation. And it's the public realizing all at once that evil can be domestic, not foreign, not exotic, not lurking in abandoned castles, domestic, across a driveway, behind a polite smile. After the discoveries under the house, the investigation expanded into a grim accounting. Victims were identified as best as possible. Families were notified. The community became a pressure chamber of grief and anger. And at the center of it all was the man whose name now carried a weight it didn't have a month earlier: John Wayne Gacy. The next stage in cases like this is always the same on paper: charges, court filings, evidence processing, interviews, but emotionally it feels like something else. It feels like the world has been split open and you can see what it keeps beneath the surface. Gacy ultimately admitted to killing many young men, and he was convicted of 33 murders. That number is repeatedly documented in reputable summaries because it became one of the most infamous tallies in modern American criminal history. 33 is the number people repeat because it's large enough to sound unreal and still anchored enough to be true. But here's what the number hides. It hides time. It hides repetition. It hides the way a predator can become routine, the way a neighborhood can continue, the way missing posters can fade on telephone poles while life goes on above a crawl space filling up beneath someone's feet. If you want to feel the true horror of 33, don't picture a pile. Picture a calendar. Picture years. Picture birthdays that never arrived and mothers who kept a bedroom the same because changing it felt like surrender. Picture the ordinary machinery of American life continuing: holidays, school seasons, new jobs, while a man used the same house as an endpoint again and again. That's the thing that makes this case suffocating. It wasn't a single rupture. It was a long, sustained decay beneath a surface that looked fine. Now the trial. The trial is where a case becomes public property. It's where the grief of families intersects with the public's hunger to understand, and sometimes that hunger turns into something ugly, something close to entertainment. But the Gacy trial wasn't entertainment. It was a confrontation with a kind of evil that people do not like believing exists in their world. In 1980, Gacy was found guilty and sentenced to death, according to Britannica. The legal outcome is straightforward as a fact, but the psychological aftermath is not. Because sentencing doesn't restore the dead, it doesn't erase the years of absence, it doesn't clean the air under that house, it only provides a punctuation mark. And in this story, even the punctuation feels inadequate. Gacy was executed in 1994, a date also widely noted in reputable sources. 16 years passed between arrest and execution. 16 years in which the story remained alive in the public mind, fed by interviews, books, documentaries, and the morbid fascination that follows cases where the gap between normal and monstrous is so thin it feels like it could tear anywhere. This is where we have to talk about the clown, because the cultural aftermath of John Wayne Gacy is, in many ways, the real long-term haunting. Not the crawl space, not even the number 33, the cultural shift. Before Gacy, clowns were already unsettling to some people. Painted faces, exaggerated smiles, the way a clown's expression doesn't change even when their eyes do. But after Gacy, the clown archetype became something else in American culture, a symbol of hidden threat behind forced cheer. the idea that someone can present joy while carrying harm. That's why the phrase killer clown stuck so hard. Not because it's sensational, but because it compresses the essence of this case into a single image: innocence manipulated, trust weaponized, safety turned into performance. And once a symbol like that enters the culture, it spreads. It shows up in horror media, clowns that are not funny, not harmless, but predatory. It shows up in urban legends. It shows up in Halloween imagery. It shows up in the way people react to strangers in costumes. It shows up in real-world clown scares decades later, because once society is taught to associate a painted smile with danger, the association doesn't fade easily. Gacy's case became part of the scaffolding for modern psychological horror. The idea that the monster isn't a creature, it's a neighbor. The idea that the threat isn't supernatural, it's social camouflage. And perhaps the most disturbing cultural lesson is this: the scariest monsters aren't the ones you can identify, they're the ones who can pass. That's what made Gacy so effective for so long. Not intelligence in the cinematic sense, not supernatural cleverness, something simpler. He understood how to look like what people wanted to see. A friendly businessman, a community volunteer, a man who could show up in a clown suit at events and be photographed as safe. And while people looked at the photograph, they didn't look at the foundation. They didn't look at the crawl space. Now, there's another uncomfortable layer to this story that a serious documentary has to acknowledge: the way social attitudes of the time shaped the case. Many victims were teenage boys and young men. In the 1970s, missing young men, especially those perceived as runaways or living on the margins, did not always trigger immediate massive investigation. That reality doesn't excuse anything, but it helps explain how a pattern of disappearance can persist without breaking through the noise of everyday life. That's a haunting too, a systemic haunting. The way certain lives are treated as less urgent, the way predators exploit that, the way communities learn too late what they should have learned earlier. Gacy did not only commit murders, he exploited gaps in attention, gaps in urgency, gaps in who society decides to protect. And that's why even decades later, the story still feels alive in a uniquely disturbing way. Because it's not just about one man, it's about the environment that allowed him to operate. Which brings us to the final layer of the tape library tone, the lingering aftermath. What happens to a house like that? What happens to a neighborhood? What happens to the word home when a house becomes a container? The physical property at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue was eventually demolished, and a different house now stands in its place, an attempt by time and construction to overwrite a horror that shouldn't have had an address in the first place. This detail is widely mentioned in general references. If you want, I can provide a sourced verification list in the next step. But overwriting a place doesn't overwrite the idea, because ideas don't live in wood, they live in people. You can bulldoze a house and still have neighbors who remember the smell. You can pour a new foundation and still have a street that feels colder at night. You can build fresh walls and still have a town that flinches at certain headlines, certain anniversaries, certain names. The tape library ending doesn't offer comfort, it offers awareness. So here's the awareness this case leaves behind, and it's the part that makes people uncomfortable in a way that supernatural stories often don't. Because a ghost story lets you say, "That's not my world." This story forces you to admit it is. A man can appear normal, a street can look safe, a house can be quiet, and beneath it, something unspeakable can exist for years without being properly named. And the most chilling part isn't that the police eventually found him. The most chilling part is how much life happened while he was still free. How many normal days passed, how many doors opened politely, how many parents went to sleep thinking the world on their street was basically predictable. That's the true killer clown effect. The painted smile is just a symbol. The real horror is the idea that performance can be lethal.